The world rolled and lurched, jolting QRS awake and into a groggy daze. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to will himself into wakefulness. The floor beneath him lurched violently again, and his head banged painfully against metal bars. The scent of blood tinged the air and he felt a wetness trickle over his cheek, dripping off of his chin. Lifting a hand to his head after steadying himself, he discovered a wicked gash over his temple. "Hey, you! You're finally awake." QRS set down his hand and twisted towards the source of the voice, wincing as his cramped muscles protested the movement. He stopped halfway, feeling pressure against his right leg. Shifting his weight gingerly, he tested what he last recalled was a grievous wound where his haunch had been carved out by the devil butcher. He felt around, the flesh was slack but unmarred. Still in half a daze, he leaned back against the bars of his cage, trying to collect himself. "What's going on?" QRS asked as the cage continued to shudder. "Where is this?" "Who knows?" the female's voice said lightly. "They've been dragging us upriver for days." Days? Had he been out for that long? His stomach growled. "Hey now," the voice piped up at the sound. "I'm pretty inedible, so don't come groping over here." Curious over her claim, QRS turned enough to look over his shoulder. A frown formed over his face as he saw nothing but an empty cage behind his own. Down here, near the floor of the cage, was a small being, a short creature with gangly arms and legs, wild black hair and dusky skin. Two yellow eyes with large, round pupils looked black at him from over a compact nose. "A Spriggan. I think I saw you there." QRS furrowed his brow. "When that demon emperor first showed up." "At the festival?" she replied. "That wasn't me." "How did you end up here, then?" QRS asked as the cage lurched again. "My tribe's from the eastern part of the hills," she replied. "We lived under some cliffs near the river. Yaldabaoth's fiends overran us just after midwinter, right after the festival, I guess. We didn't even stand a chance. At first, I thought we were going to be eaten or have our souls taken or something, but then they split us up. I've been on top of a tower of cages till today." Worry furrowed his brow. The portion of the Abelian River that the Spriggan described as our home was a day or two north of the Dale of Defiance. If Yaldabaoth's forces kept going north up the river, they would eventually encroach upon his territory. At the thought of his family, he looked around. "Is it just us?" he asked. "There's no others in this caravan?" The Spriggan gave him an odd look. "It's just us and this big dumb animal I've never seen before. First time I saw you, you were alone on this travois being dragged in from somewhere else. They brought my cage down and added it to yours." They had separated him from his son. After keeping them together for months, why would they do that? His head pounded as he tried to make sense of what was going on. "So you're from another set of those caged towers," he said slowly. "I saw others from where I was imprisoned before." "There weren't just one or two," the Spriggan nodded. "I was stuck on top of mine, so I could see them all up and down the valley. It's as if they're trying to capture everyone." The sight of the valley from his cage returned to him, and he sighed in relief. Maybe he still had most of it right. Still, the Spriggan's location had been a day away, yet she could see even more stretching to the north. The sheer scale of Yaldabaoth's activities beggared the imagination. "I see, then, have you heard about some place called a laboratory?" he asked. "Yaldabaoth mentioned moving me there before they knocked me out." "You might know more than I do about that," the Spriggan said. "I only heard it once before they tossed me onto here." QRS examined their surroundings. The Spriggan said that they had been going upriver for days, yet the valley was nowhere to be seen. They were instead traveling through a dry gulch filled with shrubs and grass. Based on this, he thought they should still be somewhere in the hills, which were arid and covered in windswept shrub and grassland. At their speed, they would still be in the east. "Why don't you escape?" QRS asked. "This place is so perfect for you to hide in, and it doesn't seem like there are any sentries or patrols." "Oh, don't think I haven't tried," the Spriggan said. "Once we left the valley and entered this gulch, I did my damnedest. These cages aren't made of any metal I've ever seen, though. I wasn't able to use my ability to grow in size and pop it open, and the bars are too narrow to slip out of." The last was spoken in rueful tones, and the Spriggan shifted in her cage. "Anyways," she said, "I'm Senyara, and I don't feel like calling you hey you forever. It's QRS." After all that had happened, his name brought only sour thoughts to mind. QRS, huh? Senora mused. Well, we're going to need all the QRS we can get if we're going to do something about this. QRS looked back at Senora with an incredulous look. Do something? He said. How? Yaldabaoth and his servants are so powerful, what do you think we can do? Who knows, Senora replied. But I didn't get as far as I have by giving up at the first discouraging thing. I think we're well beyond discouraging things, QRS snorted derisively. We don't even know where we are, or where we're headed. You might not, but I do. QRS frowned over his shoulder. I thought you said you didn't know where this laboratory was, or where we are, for that matter. I don't, Senora said. But I do know where we were, and in what direction we've been heading in. We've been going north, following the river that comes down from the Barfolk lands to the northwest. Earlier today, we split off and started heading north after the river started to bend. QRS tested the air. Based on how much moisture there was in addition to Senora's claim, it meant that they were almost to the edge of the hills. Why had they come so far? When Yaldabaoth had mentioned a laboratory, QRS figured that he would be put to work as a slave at some place, since he was apparently too costly to be harvested for flesh. Did the reach of the Demon Emperor really extend this far? He reflexively tensed up at a twinge of fear. His tribal lands were just beyond the edge of the hills, in the aspen forests to the northeast. Seems like you thought of a reason to fight, Senora noted from her cage. You want to do something now? QRS rose in his cage, struggling to keep his balance as the travois was dragged along. Some sort of beast was drawing it, one that he had never seen or heard of before. He couldn't see past its massive form. Behind them was only the rugged trail, with the fresh marks of their passing leaving a long pair of lines that disappeared behind the turns of their path. Are you sure we're the only ones? QRS asked. This beast can't be dragging us off to wherever it is on its own. Well, it did arrive back there with you the same way, Senora answered, so apparently it can. We haven't been given food or water for a few days, so we must be getting close. Or they could have just sent us out to die, he muttered. I don't know what happened where you were kept, Senora said, but they sure went out of their way keeping everyone alive where I was. They've got their own thing going on, and I've no idea what it is aside from making people suffer as much as they can without killing them, so at least we can cross that possibility off, eh? Now that she mentioned it, QRS understood it to be true. Everyone he had seen in his prison was kept alive, to the point of being forcefully healed. The only time their numbers diminished was when they were taken away, never to be seen again, which he supposed was what was happening to them now. I don't understand any of this, QRS mumbled. Why go through all this? Why attack everyone in the first place? They're fiends, Senora shrugged. Who knows why they do anything? They certainly don't care for what we think, and they don't seem to think in any way that I can make sense out of. All we can see is that they're pure evil. Then, what? Do we just wait for a chance? Pretty much, Senora nodded. We'll watch and wait. Everyone screws up at some point, even fiends like them. QRS had no reason to doubt her. Spriggans lived long lives, and she had probably seen far more than QRS ever would. You've fought against fiends before? He asked. A few times, Senora answered. Angels and elementals too. They're all a different kind of nasty, but I've never seen one so powerful as Yaldabaoth and his minions before. Then you don't think we can win? Win? Senora snorted. Who cares? We survive, or we die, and I would rather be free either way. You can waste your chances going down fighting, but I'll be running as far away as I can. Run? QRS frowned. You're not going to fight to free your people? Senora furrowed her brow, then shook her head. You said it yourself, she told him. Yaldabaoth is too strong. No one is fighting that. Just take your people and run the hell away. What he did to my home, he can probably do to your village or whatever it is just as easily. But where can we run? QRS asked her. We've been dragged all the way to the edge of the hills. That must mean his control must stretch at least that far. For you? East, probably, through the neck. Going south will drag you too close to that whole mess that we just came through. There's the foothills and mountains to the north, but I hear that the Zirn make their home up there somewhere. Even if you survive trespassing, there's tales about even more powerful things lurking in the northern ranges that no one wants to mess with. East, QRS home village was a few days northeast of the Abelian Hills, in the forests below the foothills of the mountains. If the opportunity arose, if he could make it out alive, if Yaldabaoth hadn't stretched his hand that far yet, he could raise the alarm. Save for his eldest son, his entire family was waiting for him still. It was still months to winter, so they could make their way eastwards a fair distance, but how far could they go? Was there even a place for them to live beyond their ancestral homes? There should be. There was no reason that it wouldn't be the case. The wilderness was vast, and the spine of the northern ranges stretched far beyond the horizon. There should be plenty of forests and rivers provided they traveled along the foot of the mountains. The travois followed the trail around a soft turn downhill, and the scent of wood smoke drifted in the air as they continued on their way. QRS thought he could see their destination. At the bottom of the forested gulch below, there was a makeshift cluster of crude buildings where rows of cages could be seen peeking out from between the trees. Figures milled about, but, at their distance, QRS could not make out whether they were fiends, prisoners, or something else entirely. Several hours later, they arrived with the morning gloom painting the eastern skies. Before them lay a settlement of sorts where demons moved unmarked crates and bags from place to place, loading, unloading and sorting out whatever it was that they were handling. Within the open-walled structures he had seen from above, gangs of prisoners were chained together before long tables where they appeared to be toiling away. Before he could see what they were doing, their cages were unloaded from the travois and dumped onto the ground, sending QRS sprawling. He fell forward, rolled twice, and slammed into the bars on the other side of his cage. In the faint light cast by the flames of the camp beyond, a shadow fell across him. "Right on time," Demon Emperor Yaldabaoth said. "Excellent work, my friend." QRS struggled to gain his feet, backing away from the bars facing Yaldabaoth. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Senyara do the same. Rather than walk up to stand before them, he went to the beast at the front of the travois. "Now," he said, "I wonder if there has been any mischief conducted along the way." Yaldabaoth leaned forward, and the strange beast turned its head. Gem, is that so?" Yaldabaoth said, Even after I went out of my way to say so." The Demon Emperor came back to the front of the cages, stopping before Senyara's. The Spriggan female had pressed herself to the bars at the back of her cage. "My friend here says that you tried to escape by enlarging yourself and breaking the cage," Yaldabaoth said, "and that you continue plotting to do so. I believed I warned you from attempting anything of the sort. What do you have to say for yourself?" No, he spoke right over her. "I suppose the time for excuses is long past. To think that you would spurn my mercy from the first incident." Senyara looked up helplessly at Yaldabaoth, eyes filled with terror. "A just and proper punishment is due for breaking the rules," Yaldabaoth said. "For what are rules without the will to enforce them?" Yaldabaoth straightened to his full height, firelight glinting off of the strange adornment resting on the bridge of his nose as he adjusted it with the middle finger of his right hand. From his mouth came a single word: "Grow." QRS flinched away, recalling the cursed voice that had stolen his will. It was not directed at him, however, nor did he think he could be commanded to grow. He looked to the side. In the other cage, Senyara grew from a height of 1 meter to 2. "Grow." Senyara grew again, the panic on her face plain to see. She bent her back to fit into her cage, while her arms pushed desperately against the bars. "Grow." "Ieee." A keening wail rose from the Spriggan, trapped within her cage. She had curled up into a ball that pressed against its confines. "Keep growing." A mess of flesh, limbs and hair pushed out against the bars, Senyara continued to enlarge, and her voice could no longer be heard. All at once, the bulging skin on one side ruptured, spilling its pressured contents over the grass. Yaldabaoth stood watching, arms crossed, a tight smile on his lips. QRS fought the urge to retch at the stench. "A fitting punishment for her actions, don't you agree?" Yaldabaoth's smile turned QRS' way. "Our friend has mentioned nothing against you, so it appears that you'll be able to offer your contributions here. Alas, I cannot supervise things here directly, there is so much to do, after all, but, rest assured, your work will be of significant value. Before I leave, allow me to introduce you to your new comrade. I am sure you will find his bright outlook most refreshing." As if on cue with Yaldabaoth's words, a stout figure appeared. It was adorned in a strange and unfamiliar outfit with stains of various colors smeared over its white material. QRS suspected much of it to be blood and ichor. The long beak on its mask made QRS wonder if it was some sort of avian beastman. "Welcome," he said in a cheery voice. "Welcome, 1,000 times welcome, good volunteers. I am Pulcinella, and I offer you the most joyful of greetings to your humble new abode." "Volunteers?" QRS wrinkled his snout. "Why, yes," Pulcinella replied, "volunteers." The beaked mask turned to Senyara's cage. "Oh, how sad, how sad," Pulcinella cried in mournful tones, "but at least you must feel better, knowing that you have not shared the same fate." QRS furrowed his brow in confusion. How did he come up with that line of thinking? "I didn't volunteer for anything like this," he told the strange being. "But you did volunteer for something, yes?" The voice lost none of its cheer. "That would make you a volunteer." QRS glowered through the bars of his cage. He had certainly offered himself in the place of his son, but that had little to do with anything here. "Yes, yes, volunteers are so precious," Pulcinella continued without prompting. "So brave. So selfless and kind. I love kindness. I love selflessness. Volunteers make people happy, that's why I love volunteers." What do you want, exactly?" QRS asked. The beaked figure waddled towards him. Pulcinella would barely reach his waist if QRS was standing upright. "What do I want? What do you want? What does anyone want? To be happy, of course. Worry not, my brave volunteer." Pulcinella pointed to himself with both of his hands, "for I am a volunteer as well. Together, let us bring happiness to many." Pulcinella whirled away with a grace that belied his rotund appearance. "Hey, how about letting me out?" QRS shouted. Without a glance in his direction, the figure in white disappeared into the closest building. QRS stood in his cage, turning to look around. The rest of the place appeared to ignore his existence, and Yaldabaoth appeared to have disappeared without a trace while QRS' attention was occupied by Pulcinella. His new comrade's gushing ramblings were nothing if not suspicious. No, they were more like the ravings of the deranged. After some time, a disfigured-looking fiend of some sort hopped out of a building nearby. QRS couldn't tell what it was, even when it looked over to stand in front of him. To QRS, it looked nothing more than a multi-legged blob of smooth pink flesh with mouths and tentacles that resembled thick, elongated tongues. He eyed the fiend warily and was abruptly struck in the face by one of its tentacles, the blow leaving a smear of sticky mucus over his eyelids. Reeling back weakly, he brought his arms up to cover his head. A second tentacle came up and smashed into his groin. His legs buckled as he gritted his teeth. The fiend reached out with 3 of its disgusting appendages, and the cage was tumbled into the air. QRS face slammed into the bars on the way down. He opened his swollen eyes a crack and 5 of the fiend's mouths opened below, each laughing in a different, high-pitched voice. It continued tumbling the cage as it hopped off towards wherever it was bringing him. QRS' world was too busy heaving and spinning for him to tell where. As he was tossed along, the morning light dimmed and the cage stopped its chaotic movements. The fiend turned the cage until QRS could face its 5 equally stupid-looking grins. Though nausea and pain assailed him, he kept his face a mask, frowning back at the thing. The grins slid off of the demon's head. Its eyeless face seemed to peer at QRS as it shook the cage about again. When he offered no reaction, it chuffed and continued on its way, no longer tumbling the cage about. The bits of lore that QRS knew of when it came to fiends appeared to be at least partly correct. They were evil things that either promoted or reveled in suffering and anguish, and everything they did seemed to go out of the way to draw it forth. They quickly became bored if their playthings did not react in a satisfying manner. If they couldn't get what they wanted, they would just kill you or leave to pursue the next promising victim. Either way, your misery would end. This was also what puzzled QRS. Even while behaving this way, there seemed to be some sort of underlying purpose to everything that they did. Up until this point, they had kept people alive, Yaldabaoth's machinations dictating their cruel actions for the sake of some incomprehensible scheme. His thoughts were interrupted when the cage was heaved into the air and slammed into a hard surface, bringing its journey to an end and QRS face first into the bars again. "Oh?" A familiar voice sounded from nearby. "Oh? Oh, Ohio? It seems our lovely volunteer has arrived. It appears that a new friend has appeared to spark much joy. A stout form waddled into view. It was the strange fiend with the beaked mask, Pulcinella. "Welcome, my dear," he said in a low voice that rose in volume. "Welcome, my fellow volunteer. Please don't mind the mess, we were just situating our guests." QRS looked around. He was in one of the open-walled buildings he had seen coming in. The edges were lined in cages, each with a prisoner inside. Some were bound to flat surfaces, while others were simply left free to roam in confinement. They were arranged in sets, in groups of a half-dozen for each race. He noted Armat, bugbears, ogres, hobgoblins, gnolls and a few others he was not familiar with. They all stared back at him, making QRS shift uncomfortably despite himself. All were carnivorous to at least some degree, and being subjected to the gaze of a predator was never a nice thing, especially in his weakened and vulnerable state. He glared back, resolving to not show any fear before them, and, in doing so, realized that there was something not quite right with many. While some predictably fixed hungry eyes on him, others seemed not quite there. Even not being of his race, he could tell that there were those amongst the others who looked dangerously unwell. He hoped that there wasn't some sort of disease going around the place. A line of fiends appeared, carrying great cords of wood in their arms and claws and tentacles. The scene tugged at a fragment of QRS' hazy memories, but before he could pin it in his mind, Pulcinella came around again. "We are prepared, my friends," he said in a ceremonious voice tinged with barely concealed excitement, "prepared to prepare. As the newest of our new friends has arrived, let us become familiar with our volunteer, let us partake in joyous fellowship." The beaked thing's meandering words only added to QRS' confusion over what was happening. Were they being asked to get along with one another? To cooperate in some task? "Now, my dear friends," Pulcinella continued, "I have an important question for you. Have you heard of the saying you are what you eat?" The prisoners responded to the question with silence, and, into that silence, the clatter of chains came. "Why, of course you have." Pulcinella spoke over the metallic sound. "It is in your ways, your culture, after all. To become strong, by eating the strong." QRS turned his head to the source of the clattering chains. At the entrance to the building, a slight figure shuffled in, followed by a fiend nearly identical to the Devil Warden from his old prison. By its thin build and pale skin, the figure in chains appeared to be a human. Whether it was male or female, he could not tell. Recalling his own recent experiences, he wondered if they would be using it as a source of meat for the others. When he was younger, QRS had joined raids against the walls of the human nation to the west of the hills, out of curiosity for a strange foe that he had never tested his mettle against before. The defenders were armed and armored, but their equipment paled in comparison to that of dwarven make. Individually, no, even in groups, they were weak. Why they had even built such a wall was beyond him. It was a declaration of strength, a monument that invited challengers, drawing those just like him. His time there was a disappointing experience overall, but at least captured humans had value as slaves to the dwarves and could be traded for useful things. For that reason, he had never actually tasted their flesh before, despite capturing many. This human looked even weaker than those of the wall. There couldn't be that much meat on it. It was possible that it took fewer spells of healing to fully restore, thus saving on mana. He looked to the slab in the middle of the room, and the fire that roared below. It was similar to the City of Cages, so QRS had a fair idea of what was to come. Except, what was it Pulcinella had said? Surely he wasn't crazy enough to think they would become human by eating humans. "Please," the beaked thing in white said, "introduce yourself, my dear." The scrawny human looked around at the dozens of prisoners around it through fearful eyes, ultimately turning its head down without a word. Pulcinella tilted his head at a right angle and shrugged. "Our new human friend goes by the name of Anis," Pulcinella told them, "and you are most fortunate and privileged to have her here. She hails from the human lands over the mountains to the north, from the royal capital of Riestais itself. A famous chef, she is, and so you will be treated to the most delightful of dishes, the high cuisine of nobles and kings. She will bring you happiness with her professional expertise, as she has with so many others." The human female did not look up with Pulcinella's glowing introduction. If anything, QRS thought she looked even more miserable. Come, my lovely Anis," the beaked figure said. "Your guests await." The human looked up at Pulcinella, then at the slab in the middle of the building. The fiend behind her snorted, and she gave a fearful cry, scurrying forward. She stepped up onto a platform, where a wide variety of implements were arrayed on the slab. QR's mouth watered at the thought of food. His last meal must have been days ago, before he was taken away from the city of cages. Pulcinella waddled over in front of QR's cage, reaching up to open it. "Out with you, now, our dear volunteer," it said as the hinges creaked open. QRS stepped out. He looked around the building again, looking for something like the tables at his former prison. Finding nothing like it, he looked back at the beaked figure. "Where am I supposed to go?" QRS asked. A hand gracefully gestured to a large cart near the slab. QRS' eyes widened as realization dawned upon him, and he shot forward, dashing for the entrance. Despite his speed, which would cover the distance in a heartbeat, the devil that had accompanied the human into the building reacted, reaching out for him with a massive, clawed hand. Flow acceleration. The world slowed to a crawl as he activated a martial art. He ducked under the wicked claws and drove forward into the morning light. Then he struck the ground, face first. QRS felt himself being dragged back into the room, scraping over the dirt and gravel. He saw the base of the slab before he was raised, dangling from one leg. The scaly, black skin of the horned devil's legs filled his vision, and he looked up at his own. It had used a whip to snatch one of his ankles, and QRS swung lightly from its coils. My, Pulcinella's voice drifted in lightly from near his head. "My dear volunteer, you did volunteer, did you not?" "I changed my mind," QRS replied. "Changed your mind?" "Changed your mind," Pulcinella tittered. "Don't be silly, my love, volunteers have no choice." QRS' surroundings whirled, righting themselves once more when he was slammed onto the cart. Shackles found his wrists and ankles, stretching him tightly over its surface. Why are you doing this?" QRS' winded voice called out. "I thought I wasn't worth using for food." Such a depressing outlook. Pulcinella shook his head sadly. "We even found a place for you to share your kindness, where your selfless actions will bring happiness to your fellows. To become strong, by eating the strong," I said. "Surely you didn't think our frail and precious Annis was to be the main course? Who would want to become as weak as her? Forcing such meager sustenance upon our friends would be most cruel. But you are strong, yes? A brave, a hero, or something like that? Our friends here are nowhere near as strong as you, but your kindness has given them a chance to see this hopeful future." QRS couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was true that some races had customs where they believed that eating the strong made them stronger, who engaged in rituals where they consumed a worthy foe that they had personally vanquished. There were even races that did get stronger depending on what they ate, but nothing like this. They were trying to feed him to others as if consuming his flesh would directly grant them power. "It won't work," he growled out against the cart pressed to his cheek. "You can't become strong just by eating me." "Oh my, is this true?" Pulcinella said worriedly, "But we set up this building just to find out." The beaked figure came up to where QRS lay, bringing his strange mask close. "Are you certain of this?" He spoke in low tones. "Have you tried?" "You're insane," QRS snarled. "You are too kind." Pulcinella pulled away and straightened again. "Too kind." He clapped its hands loudly, waddling around the building again, raising his arms as if expecting the cheers of the surrounding prisoners. Come. Let us partake of the kindness of our friend," he said. "Annis, my dear, you may begin." QRS heard the sound of the metal implements being drawn nearby, and the human came into view. A long knife was in her trembling hand, and she looked down upon him, reeking of terror. He watched her arm lower, then it stopped. "What's the matter, my dear?" Pulcinella asked. Is this fellow too unfamiliar for you? Should we perhaps bring something you've already become well accustomed to?" "No," she cried, "please, no. Not again, Mr. Pulcinella, anything but that." QRS flinched as the blade touched his thigh. The cold edge drew across his skin but, surprisingly, he felt no pain. The knife slid over his skin again. "This hide, it's so tough," the human said. "Come now, you've just barely started, put a little more love into it, The point of the knife pricked his skin, then withdrew. If it were a battle, QRS wouldn't even have noticed it but Bound as he was, every action of the weak human seemed especially pronounced. He twitched at the sting of pain as the knife stabbed into his leg again. The human worked the knife deeper, striking the base with her palm, pressing her weight into it, and wiggling the blade around. QRS gritted his teeth in discomfort as she struggled. She grunted with every effort, and her labored breathing soon filled the room. The blade stopped again. "Oh my, is that all you can do?" Pulcinella asked. "You were capable of so much more just yesterday. Is there something wrong? Did they forget to feed you?" The knife, I need a better knife," the human answered. "This one's all dull and tarnished." "The knife? The blade embedded in his thigh was suddenly driven through the rest of QRS hide, punching through fat and muscle to glance off of bone. His pained howl filled the air. "This knife seems perfectly fine," Pulcinella said. "See? In and out and back and forth and swish and oops." He interrupted himself, and the haphazard movements of the blade stopped. "That might have been important, healer." Healer?" Pulcinella waddled off, and QRS' strength rapidly faded away. Middle cure wounds. Awareness returned, but the chill remained. Too much," Pulcinella said mournfully. "You closed up part of our good chef's hard work. Alas, we must try again." The human said nothing this time, and the attentions of the knife returned. It sawed and caught and tugged, opening his flesh as it worked in a way unachievable by the strikes of a skilled warrior. The knife trembled and the human would back away with a cry whenever QRS could no longer stand the slow torture and his agonized reactions came forth. Eventually, the human finished, taking a large part of QRS' leg with her. She heaved out a great sigh, looking towards Pulcinella. "What are you waiting for, my dear?" Pulcinella said. "It's time to work your culinary magic. Our hungry friends await." She glanced towards QRS before working to slice up his flesh. QRS, restrained as he was forced to watch. The aroma accompanying her preparations started to fill the air, and QRS' thoughts slowly grew dim. "It's done." The human's voice broke through the murky haze, and she released a ragged breath. Healing magic washed over QRS, mending his leg and snapping him back to pained awareness. "Excellent work, my dear Chef Anis." Pulcinella clapped his hands energetically. "I knew it wasn't a mistake to choose you for this task. Now, what is the dish called, my love?" "It's stir-fried, leg, with roasted garlic mushrooms, sautéed onions and diced forest greens in a savory sauce." That seems a mouthful," Pulcinella said. "Surely there is some inspiration for this? Where is your inner artiste?" "Then, Abelian stir-fry à la Pespel." "Marvelous." Pulcinella clapped his hands grandly. "Simply marvelous. Yet another revolution in the culinary arts by our dear Anis. Surely, your talents know no bounds. Everyone will be thrilled at this new addition to their menu." The aroma of the dish filled the air as Pulcinella brought it around in front of all of the cages, and the scent of QR's own cooked flesh filled his nostrils. "Now, remember, dear friends," Pulcinella said. "If you wish for this special dish, all you need do is request it by name and our precious Anis will lovingly prepare for you a hearty helping." He inhaled deeply, releasing a satisfied sigh before continuing in a lively voice. "My, this truly is a delight." Pulcinella looked around the building. "Who would like to have this first course? Surely it would be better while it's still hot." The prisoners around the room remained silent. Even the ogres and bugbears had the pride to turn down food after witnessing the reprehensible display. "No one?" Pulcinella made another round around the room. "Come now, surely there must be some interest? Far better than the cold, raw mints from before this breakthrough in high cuisine, yes?" Once again, silence followed in the wake of Pulcinella's words. "There's no need to be shy, we're all friends here, after all. Just one word, one gesture, anything to let me know, and this joyous entree shall be yours. It wouldn't do to waste good food." The conspicuously loud noise of a growling stomach filled the air, and all present turned their gazes on QRS. "Hey!" Pulcinella let out a noise of its own, hee ha ha ha. Strange, squeaking laughter rose from the beaked figure clad in stained white garments. "Fabulous," he cried, "wonderful. I was not wrong, not wrong. Our brave volunteer has volunteered to be the first to partake." Pulcinella motioned excitedly to the horned devil nearby. Give him the taste of happiness. Orders for food punctuated the evening air, which was filled with the aroma of meaty dishes. Whether they were appetizing or not probably depended on who you asked, but it agitated QRS to no end that nearly all of them smelled edible to him. The roughly constructed building that they occupied had been renamed Café Anis, in honor of the human chef's advancement in the fields of cuisine, and the prisoners learned the names of all the meals that she came up with over the weeks. They were all made with the main course of QRS, of course. As Pulcinella had promised, all they needed to do was ask. They fed QRS with those same dishes. He refused at first, of course, but the human would eventually just make something out of him without asking. He turned his head at her offerings, but the fiends assisting her just pried his jaws open and forced them down. If he vomited, they would just use a spade to scoop it up from the ground and force him to eat it again, with an extra helping of dirt and filth. QRS howled as a knife entered his arm, and the human peeled away a long slice of flesh. At some point, she had received enchanted tools, and no longer struggled with his tough hide. She no longer flinched away from his reaction to her attentions, either. Over time, QRS thought, she stopped recognizing him as a living being. He had just become a slab of meat, perhaps a somewhat noisy ingredient to work with. The human female came up with new dishes every few days, and QRS seethed when the prisoners eventually became used to the routines of their new jail, clamoring over one another to taste her new creations. Yet, he couldn't blame them. These fiends broke down body and spirit like it was an endlessly satisfying meal of its own, their appetite for it, bottomless. All around him, week by week, he watched as the prisoners' wills were twisted and warped, turning them into little more than base animals capable of speech. Except for one. Except for the human. She came as a prisoner, just like they, yet even the smallest suggestions cowed her into compliance. Like some pet, she turned docile, no longer offering complaint or showing even the slightest hesitation. A pet of the fiend Pulcinella, pouring her efforts into fulfilling his desire to grant happiness. It was not long until her chains came off, and she was allowed to roam freely. She had a number of fiends that answered to her call, delivering whatever she required for her ever more sophisticated craft. After weeks of being subjected to her work, he still couldn't understand it. Why would one need hundreds of ways to prepare food? Some of it he couldn't even recognize as meat anymore, so different it looked and smelled. Humans were surely a soft and weak people, spending so much time on such frivolous pursuits. He cast a baleful gaze to the human as she worked at her table, but she simply ignored him. Was she getting stronger, strong enough to shrug off the intimidating presence that radiated from his raw strength? No. She ignored him because she knew he had been rendered harmless. The humans of the wall were much the same. So proud and fearless in their fortifications, shining equipment and teeming numbers. So brave, until they encountered a true warrior who proved all of that worthless. Every time, they were reduced to pitiful, wailing wretches that soiled themselves and cried for mercy. A disgusting race with weak bodies and even weaker wills, lacking the pride and resolve of decent living beings. It was a wonder that they hadn't been wiped out of existence. If QRS somehow managed to escape and regain his freedom, he figured that he would remedy this whenever the opportunity presented itself. A trio of long shadows cast themselves over the floor. Pulcinella entered the building, flanked by two grotesque, tentacled demons, the same as the one who had brought in his cage after his arrival. Pulcinella stopped to inhale deeply. Ah, tantalizing as always, this aroma. He released a contented sigh. Is there no limit to your skill, my dear Anis? Your talent was surely wasted on the aristocrats of the royal capital. The human's steps slowed at his praise, then resumed as she carried a platter to an ogre nearby. Pulcinella waddled up to her, inspecting its contents. It appears that something is missing. He stroked his chin thoughtfully. There were special instructions for this one, yes? But Pulcinella reached into a crate placed near the ogre's cage and withdrew a fistful of what QRS thought was gravel. The pebble-sized fragments were sprinkled over the platter. The human opened her mouth silently, then closed it again. You are confused, my love? Pulcinella asked. Well, I suppose these matters are beyond your expertise. Allow me to explain. His hand opened the cage, in which the ogre was bound to a standing table. Pulcinella retrieved the platter of food from the human's hands. An exploration of our concept, of our theme, Pulcinella continued. Armat have a most wondrous biology. They can consume ore, which in turn allows them to grow fur as strong as iron, or mithril, or adamantite, depending on what they are fed. Ogres, unfortunately, do not. They only have their naked hides to protect themselves from the sting of swords and arrows. It is unfair, unjust, don't you think? Pulcinella tilted his head slightly, leaning closer to the human. She only stared back silently as he continued. In an act of overflowing compassion, our dear Demon Emperor Yaldabaoth has resolved to rectify this unreasonable reality. You see, we have taken this one's stomach out, and replaced it with one from an Armat. The fiend spread his hands out at the gleeful revelation, and QRS fought to keep from retching. Such genius! Pulcinella proclaimed, such kindness! Such is our Demon Emperor Yaldabaoth. Our dear ogre friend will now be able to consume ore and grow an armored hide. Or was it fur? An armored ogre, such an improvement, don't you agree? To be certain, we have performed the procedure with this pair. One will consume his food normally, and the other will have it put straight into his belly, just in case chewing matters, you see. We will leave no possibility unexplored. No possibility, since Armat gain their traits while they are still young, I wonder how many children we have left in stock. In a demonstration of his insane methods, the muttering Pulcinella scraped the plate of food out into the gaping wound propped open in the ogre's stomach. The ogre only drooled like an invalid in reaction. But what about the Armat? The human asked. The Armat? Pulcinella replied, which Armat? Oh, those Armat. They are making everyone else happy, of course. What? By knowing the unfortunate conditions that have been visited upon them, everyone else knows that they are in a better situation by comparison, thus, they are happier. It is a clear and logical thing. The beauty of countless people provided happiness by those loving few as a solution of such elegant simplicity. Pulcinella reached up to pat the cheek of the drooling ogre. Think of our good friend Armat, he said, and be happy. Be strong. Do not spurn his love. He continued moving about the room, inspecting the surrounding prisoners and offering his insane commentary. It wasn't long after he arrived that QRS realized that all the guests were experiments, subjected to various conditions. One of each race was fed raw meat, another had raw meat pushed straight into its stomach through a slit in its belly, just in case chewing took something away. Another had prepared meals introduced in the same fashion, for the same reason. The rest had various alterations. Some, like the ogre, had their organs replaced with those of other races. One of the Armats had jagged stones grafted into its skin in place of fur. There was a hobgoblin with its eyes replaced by the compound eyes of some insectoid race. There were a half-dozen each, and each was fed QRS, rendered into various complex dishes by the human chef. The human returned to the counter and walked up to QRS, raising her knife. Ah, hold if you will, my dear Anis, Pulcinella raised his oddly shaped hand. We have come to the conclusion that feeding strong individuals, even with meals created through your considerable talents, does not make weaker ones stronger. So we are done with this one. The two tentacled demons came forward. The human began to shake uncontrollably, clutching at the counter with her free hand. No, her voice was frantic. You said, why you told me, no, don't send me back. I can't go back to that. She collapsed to her knees, knife clattering to the ground. Pulcinella turned towards her at the sound. Oh. No. No. Shh. Pulcinella spoke in soothing tones as he came up and embraced the quivering human, gently stroking her hair. You need not worry now, my precious, he said. Your esteemed contributions are still required here. What do we do with this one? One of the demons asked, and QRS tensed. Throw him back into his cage for now. Pulcinella waved his hand towards them without looking. Bring in the new materials as well. QRS chains were removed and fleshy tentacles wrapped around his body before he could react. He flew into his cage, casually tossed from where he had been bound. The door slammed shut even as he reeled from the impact. Careful, now, Pulcinella said. Careful. We're done with healing our volunteer until we find more work for him. The second demon came in with a covered cart, rolling it in front of the human chef. For your new menu, Pulcinella gestured grandly towards her. The human stretched her arm towards the tarp covering the cart. What is it? I'm so glad that you asked, My bright and lovely Anis, Pulcinella gushed, a wondrous, exotic and plentiful supply of materials from the north has come into our possession. The human's hand stopped at the fiend's words. Not humans, of course, Pulcinella answered, the growing look of horror on her face. You have graduated beyond the need to practice with the materials most familiar to you. No, we are past that, we are going international. Cosmopolitan. A world of fine dining awaits, my magnificent chef Anis. At Pulcinella's continued prompting, the human threw back the cover. The prisoners around the room all looked curiously at the contents. They watched as the human reached in and withdrew a furred arm, tipped with long claws. She placed it on the table, poking and prodding it experimentally. Smells like Armat, one of the gnolls said. The Armats placed in a corner of the room froze. The largest one turned an accusatory glare at Pulcinella. Why you lied to us, she shouted. You said you wouldn't feed us our own kind. You promised. Was there a promise like that? It certainly didn't apply to QRS. My dear friends, Pulcinella parted his hands in a disarming gesture. Would I lie to you? When have I ever failed to deliver on my promises? The prisoners around the building fell silent, and audible swallows could be heard. Their faces, the ones QRS could read, anyways, made it clear that whatever promises were made, the results were undesirable, at best. Now, my lovely Anis, Pulcinella turned back to the human, work your culinary magic. Fresh new discoveries await. The human brought several pieces to the counter, laying them out separately from one another. Her brow furrowed as she frowned down on the seemingly random assortment. QRS peered at the nearby countertop to the closest piece. It was a mess of blood and fur, a limb that looked like it had been ripped off. Rather than being separated at a joint or even at some point along the arm, half of its shoulder was still attached. Protrusions of bone where the shoulder had been shattered by some brutal blow glistened in the firelight. The fur and hide gave off a reddish, metallic sheen. It was clearly not Armat, but it did share some similarities. If this was the case, the appearance indicated the strength of the individual it came from. Like the Armat, whatever race the parts belonged to might have consumed ores that strengthened their natural defenses. Even a moderately strong member would have fur that offered more protection than the best of what the humans of the wall used for armor. QRS questioned whether he could have done this himself, let alone in such reliable frequency. His gaze went to the other pieces on the counter. They were in a similar condition to the first, but they were all from different bodies. The coloration, textures and size were all different, no two exactly the same. The human continued her work, turning out dish after aromatic dish. The cart was emptied, and QRS wondered what great warrior had fallen upon these people. He couldn't imagine the sort of battle that had ensued to produce these grisly results. That was, until a demon came in with another cart. How much more do you need? The demon asked the chef. The human looked up from her work. Her mouth twitched as her eyes fell over the grotesque form across from her. How much? She looked at the orders strung up in front of her, then around the room. We're about 1/3 done here, is there enough? Or do we have to? The human turned her gaze towards QRS in his cage, and he felt himself bristle. A dull anger rose out of the pit of his stomach. If not for the bars of his cage, he would tear this disgusting creature apart. These humans had no pride, no honor, they were filth below even the most desperate goblin. No need, the demon said, we got plenty. Should last a place like this for years. QRS' mouth fell open. He stopped keeping track of all of the different corpses. Years? It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. An endless tide of bodies shredded by the force of some unfathomably powerful monster. Maybe this was the true power of Yaldabaoth, who so frivolously toyed with so many of the greatest champions of the wilderness tribes. No one could fight this. They could only run and pray that he did not pursue them. A loud bang jarred him out of his thoughts. A tentacled demon holding a studded metal rod had struck the corner of his cage. What's your order? It demanded, chef's closing up soon. QRS glowered silently at the demon, and it returned his look with a sneer. Ah, I get it, it spat out of a side mouth. Just can't get over the taste of yourself, can you? You demis really are hopeless animals. A tentacle reached over and snatched a metal bowl from the counter. Hey! Someone complained, that's my order. Shut up, an unseen mouth shot back, chef'll make you another. The bowl was tossed between the bars of the cage, landing in front of QRS. "Have a taste of civilization, you filthy savage." QRS stared at the bowl until long after it had cooled. He finally reached out to take it. Without the constant haze of pain visited upon him during previously prepared meals, cold reason returned. Senyara was right, he needed to escape, somehow. To maximize his chances, he needed to recover and keep his strength up. He would wait for the opportunity that must eventually come. He needed to return home to his family and tribe, to get them away, before they were all subjected to the sick touch of Yaldabaoth. He prayed to his ancestors that he wouldn't be too late.